Coming up next, the Rowdy Rough Boys. Coming up next, the Blue G Boys. Coming up next, advertisement. Coming up next, Plank. Coming up next, Sesame Stephen. Coming up next, Sid the Science Hunter. Coming up next, Sesame Wallace. Coming up next, Sid the Science Frankie. Coming up next, Angelo. Coming up next, Garfield. Coming up next, Sherwood. Coming up next, Odie. Coming up next, Girl Stuff. Coming up next, Boy Stuff. Coming up next, it's Mojo Jojo. Coming up next, it's him. Coming up next, Wallace. Coming up next, Aggie. Coming up next, Jaydeep. Coming up next, Dina. Coming up next, Steve. Coming up next, Gus. Coming up next, Dwight. Coming up next, Bruce. Coming up next, Toby. Coming up next, Toby. Coming up next, Steven. Coming up next, Hunter. Coming up next, Hilda. Coming up next, Frankie. Coming up next, Mandy. Coming up next, Mindy. Coming up next, Princess Butterbean. Coming up next, Millie. Coming up next, Holly. Coming up next, Charlie. Coming up next, it's Kevin. Coming up next, it's Kirby. Coming up next, it's Rudy. Coming up next, it's Ruby. Coming up next, it's Benjamin. Coming up next, it's Garrett.